is you have to deal with that. And those are things where, you know, when I started at UPS, just the culture, the idea of, no, we don't use games for training. We don't gamify training, right? That's where very quickly you learn to say, these are experiences, these are simulations, these are not games, these are simulations, right? They are interactive like a game, but their measurement and reason and goals are different.
I'm MetaRick!
Welcome back to another episode of MetaRick, where we talk about emerging technologies around the metaverse, spatial computing, XR, whichever buzzword you want to be throwing around these days to describe this amazing technology, making a more 3D immersive internet. Today's guest is Mark Gröb from UPS. He's pretty much the main go-to guy when it comes to everything XR over there. He's been around this space for a long time and really excited to kind of dive into how you got involved in the industry and get your outlook on how to build these programs from within such a large company.
Yeah, I mean, I started getting the bug of XR or VR back in, 1998. I got an internship at a Defense Department up in our research group up in Canada. And back then, headsets weren't one thing. They were kind of parts put together. So face-mounted displays, intertrack, 3DOF, 6DOF motion sensors, things of that nature running on IRIX, our big old reality engine. And then back then, being able to see telepresence, where remotely being able to look at, or in effect, like with drones, right? Through VR, very immersive, right? Being able to kind of experience something from far away as if it's nearby, right? That to me just totally blew my mind. And from that point, the aspect of just wearable technology, immersive tech, just kind of always stuck.
And talk us through a little bit of what you're doing today, right? So you're at UPS. You're kind of, I think when you first joined the company last time we talked, you were kind of kicking off this program around XR, running little tests and experiments. But talk us through how one even starts that journey.
Yeah, I mean, I came to UPS. Before UPS, I was sort of a freelancer in New York City, just doing, I would call sort of exploratory one-off projects from defense to pharmaceutical to entertainment. So when I came to UPS, what really attracted me to join was they were at a point in their sort of exploration where they really wanted to start building a practice, right? When I say building a practice, it's the aspect of, from the ground up, the architecture, planning it, having a good understanding of what works, what doesn't. So I joined UPS, and the first 6 months, 8 months, all we did was just rapid prototype. And that's the days of the original HTC Vive, maybe the Vive Pro. And, we had Alienware hardware back then, not all-in-one systems. It was Alienware combined with the Vive headset. And we were doing things from smoke and cockpit, sort of simulations, to really providing what we call sort of a guided simulation of, best practices for lifting, or what UPS calls their keys, the keys of an operation. To when I came on board, they already created a successful project, or started a project that was becoming very successful. And that was their visual hazards VR simulation for driver safety. And the concept there is the aspect of active scanning to prevent having a crash. So they had a real good sort of basic concept, right? And it was a case where I came in and I offered scale. We were able to scale it, in a tethered PC world, right? And then from then, right, it sort of expanded. They sort of realized that there's a lot of value in that type of technology. And then my vice president at the time, Joe Lawless, really started asking me questions of, hey, what would it take to build a practice? Or sort of think of it as when smartphones started being used in enterprise, right? There's architects that had to plan, kind of structure how to roll all that technology out. And that was the same sort of discussions that I was having with upper management at UPS. So, over time, we experienced things like COVID, and the advent of the all-in-one headset. And, it really got to a point where we started at the base where it was a very costly venture. The ROI models are really tough, right? But as we all know in the market, things changed, right? The realization of we're not having to rely on installing base stations and things of that nature. Instead, inside-out tracking came about. All-in-one headsets like the Oculus Quest or the HTC Vive Focus 3, Focus Plus. Those were the sort of devices that in our enterprise, we were like, hey, wait a second, this thing is really starting to have legs. And then I would say probably in the last 2 years, advent of device management, much like we had for cell phones, right? Companies like Arbor XR, Manage XR, I mean, even Meta, had an initial sway 3-4 years ago. And then now that's even coming back, right? So, it was a case of I was kind of in the right place at the right time, and I had senior management support in exploring and, implementing the technology. And that's where we are today, is we're at a point where we have a pretty mature XR training practice. We have a very good, strong foundation for that. We have processes in place that we can directly work with subject matter experts in those fields to develop the technology, right? Making them what we call federated subject matter experts. So that, even from a standpoint of corporate curriculum on how to train employees that are interested in the technology, those things are now in place, right? To the more cool stuff, lately in the news, we've been deploying a one-to-one simulator for driver safety in operations, where think of it as it's a training arcade that's actually in the facility that the drivers, will they've started to nickname the arcade. And, it's a decommissioned package car, gutted, and then we put inside that package car simulator, for them to practice the same sort of methods and practice that we did in the past, right? And then on top of that, what we're doing now is we're actually deploying mixed reality in combination with that. So think of it as, right, you have your traditional driving simulator where you would maybe even have like a proctor that would, simulate, oh, I want to blow the tire out on the driver, right? So we have sort of that traditional simulator, but we've designed the curriculum in a way so that's self-guided, so that you don't need the trainer to do it. And at the same time, that individual is doing that training, right? We're actually utilizing the rest of the space of the vehicle. So we're, anchoring, say, a simulation on how to pre-trip. So you're checking all the tires, wipers, and things like that, as a mixed reality sort of experience. And at the same time that person's doing that, we may have someone sitting in the shotgun seat of the simulator doing a 360, or what I'd call our traditional XR training of visual hazard, right? They may be there left hazard, right hazard, stale green sort of thing. And that content's shot in a way where it's in the correct perspective to where they're actually sitting in that package car. So it's all a very positive sort of experience. And then we also have in the package area. So, you have the cab where the driver is and the shotgun is, right? Here's the area where the packages actually are. We currently have like the Magic Leap 2 and other mixed reality devices where employees are learning how to pick, select, sort, how to shift as if they were, in the field, all, through this, really sort of engaging technology. And that's why they all nickname it. They call it the arcade because, in our operation, they're mandated for so many hours per week or per month in the simulator, right? And they joke, they go, it's the arcade, I don't know about you, but I remember growing up in the 90s and in the 80s that, we used to have the coin arcades, right? And a lot of our drivers, they sort of associate training to that sort of experience now. So again, it's sort of a very positive experience and things sort of cycle through. So these are the sort of things that, from the standpoint of training, it's mature, it's very exciting. And then there's other things. We have our digital insights, which is like digital twins combined with wearables. We have a lot of interesting things going on in that space. What I really can talk about, I'm not too sure yet. But, again, it's exciting stuff.
Very exciting stuff. I think there's a few things that stand out from the journey you've been on with UPS, and one of those that I want to call out is the importance of the start line. We talk a lot in this industry about trying to avoid becoming the next Sears, the next Blockbuster, and to the point where I think that's almost overused as an example, to be honest. But I think that your journey of starting so soon, back when the technology was really expensive to get started, it wasn't so easy as an all-in-one device and these MDMs that have started coming out to make it easier for the enterprise. But it helped you, once those steps of innovation came, be more prepared, where you had people that understood how it worked and understood how to run these programs. And now you're able to move much more quickly and with a little bit more agility than a lot of these enterprises that are just now trying to figure out how this stuff works and even pick that first use case to begin with. This training use case is really interesting. I think that hard skills training is probably one of the top two or three use cases that I hear about from big enterprise. And one thing that's standing out about the example you shared is this mixed reality experience using an actual UPS truck mixed with the 3D immersion and kind of combining these two ideas together. And I'm curious how much of that is leveraging like a low code, no code out of the box platform versus are you guys building all of these experiences custom in a gaming engine like a Unity or an Unreal or something like that?
So I would say in the previous, say, last 2 years, right, the technology was heavily, or most, I would say even now, I should say, most of our tech is done through the Unity game engine. Um, we've worked partner-wise with Unity as well as the company HTC over all these years to sort of orchestrate and create that technology. So the majority right now is developed through Unity, right? I'm a certified Unity developer as well as my coworkers and members of my team, right? Um, but there's a strong trend now in our group where what we're doing is we're looking for low code, no code solutions for what we do, right? Because part of the challenge, right, and part of the cost savings is we don't want to create big production projects every time we want to encapsulate some sort of hard skill that requires lots of reps, right? Part of the hard skills and our good ROI is we identify the value of reps, right? You want a lot of reps, you get that muscle memory. That's really where the learning's happening, right? Um, you know, you don't have to rely on a real situation, right, for someone to learn it. So what we're looking for now is we're really looking for a low code, no code solution where you don't have to have a macro develop the runtime and all the sort of nuances and flow of the experience. Instead, the trend now is on education is really many platform. XR is just one platform of many to give the student access to the content, right? And the level of interactivity might be different, right? For us, that's the new part of our journey is that in sort of federating or creating these subject matter experts in each of our business silos, right? Um, we want to speed up their success. So right now, we have to train them on how to use a tool like Unity, right? Because some of the pieces of these low code, no code solutions run through a tool like Unity, right? So the subject matter, the supervisor, the trainer, right? They have to understand how that tool works. What we need is a low code, no code tool where we don't have to rely on Unity. We can go to a web portal and, some people may not like it, but I call it, it's glorified PowerPoint, right? It's a case where you're creating a task list or a procedural flow, and then that's associated to all the 3D content in an environment that you have available as a sort of a template, right? To have that sort of virtual environment, and then also the ability to have it truly be a virtual classroom where, say, for example, I have an instructor and 4 students in Cranberry, New Jersey. And then in relative locations or centers around that one location, we may have 4 or so students in other locations. So it may be a class of 20 students virtually, right? And we have one subject matter expert in one space, right? There's huge cost savings just in that alone, right? Plus the knowledge sharing capability. All the sort of features it becomes more rich, right? It engages new recruits to want to do things, right? the younger generation is very apt when it comes to interactive simulations or games, right? Um, to even go as far as to say, well, what if, there's liability and risk here, but what if, we have an educational system in place where the runtimes can run on BYOD, so the recruits' personal equipment can actually access the technology, right, and be able to do things. So that onboarding process is seamless, right, for them if they have access to that technology.
Yeah,
Those
there's
are the sort of things that we're now looking at in our practice of immersive tech, because the biggest challenge is to scale, right? And it's hard to find people that have the experience and knowledge for certain aspects of training that work, right? And then on top of that, have fluency in XR technology, right? That's a big gap that currently exists. So technology like low code, no code makes total sense, right?
yeah,
So
it's
hopefully
the
that sort of answers the question.
yeah, it's very helpful. I think it's a difficult balance to strike because we want to create the best experiences possible. It's why a lot of us are drawn into this type of technology to begin with, right? There is a lot of friction. Whenever you disrupt a way of doing things, it requires a lot of extra steps at first, and then over time we optimize. In order to get an immersive 3D interactive experience, it takes different types of hardware, different types of software, different types of content. And then on top of that, it's slightly different user interface and interaction, right? So there's all these different friction points that I think as an industry we're trying to overcome. And so one of those, which seems like the biggest bottleneck from my experience, is the content. And building it manually is just very expensive, very time consuming, but sometimes necessary, right? Like if you want to train people on how to use a UPS truck and box boxes the right way and use hazards and safety all those things need to have unique UPS assets in order to provide that experience.
Yeah,
But this kind of sorry to cut you off, but it leads into another question that I had around kind of your experience being around this for so long. Is the cycles have changed from I've heard you say this in past interviews as well as a few other folks, but this idea of 7-year cycles, 5-year cycles, 2-year cycles, like there's these cycles of excitement with this technology where it kind of bubbles up, some sort of new hardware or new software, something kind of causes an excitement around the world where it becomes a little mainstream for a second. A lot of discoveries happen and then it quiets back down. And then that comes up again. And it seems like those cycles are becoming a little bit closer together. The excitement's lasted a little bit longer each time. And I'm wondering if you've found any key differences between that 7-year, 5-year, and 2-year, if it's specifically hardware that's causing that innovation or if there's particular use cases. Like what are the biggest changes from that first
well,
era to now?
what you're referring to, Gartner would call their hype cycle, right? I really think it's a combination of both hardware and software, right? Um, we still don't have the killer app, right? I call it the silver bullet, or be it hardware or software, right? But the cycles in the sense of how it sort of comes back and becomes relevant, in mainstream media. Um, you know, the technology wants to be a consumer product. Meta is known for it being the VR console, right? Which in the enterprise world, that's a negative, right? We don't want to sort of commit to gaming. We want to commit to sort of serious simulation. So depending on sort of the market that you're looking at, right? VR specifically, actually, it's been around for a while in enterprise, right? It's sort of been the sweet spot, the money maker for a lot of these hardware makers. Only now is it sort of becoming part of the limelight, right? Because there's more and more sort of consumer facing solutions like, metaverse concepts and things like that. The aspect of, the technology, because the hardware cost has come down so much, right? It's more accessible, right? And because of that, those sort of factors is what's speeding this cycle up, right? Um, that typically is how I would describe what we're seeing. The sort of need, or I would say it's more the awakening or awareness in specifically enterprise, it's really been increasing a lot because there's a lot of really good use cases now out there that people can't ignore it, right? I think before you may have been in one of my other talks, I talked about XR training in general. It gives your business or organization a huge competitive advantage when it comes to things like onboarding new employees, right? You can't ignore it now, right? It's a case where I could create a simulation to say safely pick up and build what we call walls inside of feeders, right? We have a simulation where in 45 minutes, majority of new recruits feel confident and active and willing to engage to do that activity, right? Where traditionally we would have a class say of 10 people and 8 of those people would walk out because they didn't feel engaged, confident, and sure that they could do the work, right? Because in the end, new people don't want to get yelled at by supervisors, or be put in a situation where they feel they were set up to lose, right? So having technology that can create simulations and prepare the employee for doing it the right way and doing it the right way all the time, right? Those are huge, powerful tools in bringing new people on board. And the speed of which they can learn it through immersion, hey, we can control the distractions in immersion versus in a standard traditional classroom, right? All those sort of things start building up. And that's why I think you're really sort of seeing this technology cycling faster, because more and more businesses are starting to realize there really is a value.
With these use cases, it sounds like there's a range of them, right? So earlier you were talking about the packaging example or the safety example, and now we're talking a little bit about onboarding or maybe more soft skills. I would imagine are involved in that kind of training.
Sure. Yes.
I imagine that these use cases are each kind of owned by a variety of different business units, and you've got a little bit of politics, I'm sure, that's involved with how you can align with those teams and make sure you're adding business value to them and what they're trying to accomplish. How do you balance running kind of tests with the technical group and kind of proving value for something versus trying to scale it with another business unit? How do you navigate that internally?
Well, we've gone through learning how to do that over the last, I would say I've been at UPS 6 years, 7 years now. The first 4 years was really about that. It was really the process of sort of learning for the UPS's business how to determine that value, OKRs or ROIs, right? And realizing that where is the right fit for our business, right? Um, that takes time, and for any new business, right? Um, there's a big temptation for a lot of business to say, "Oh, I'm going to hire a big consulting firm. They're going to solve the problem for me," right? But then one thing we've learned is the problem of ownership, right? If you defer ownership of this technology to the consultant, right, you're really paying for an expensive paperweight because no one within your business, the people doing the work, own it, right? And at that point, there's going to be a certain level of resentment within your own organization to people not to use it, right? By having the supervisors, the people that are doing the work, right, they own it, right? They feel that they can provide feedback into the technology, right? As a practitioner, right? My job becomes really easy at that point because really it's a case of sharing our experiences to these new subject matter experts and, being there just to say, hey, I get going in a certain direction, but here's some examples of why it wasn't successful in the past. Take it for a grain of salt, right? And then still giving them the feeling of empowerment that they own it, right? That's a huge driving force. And it also drives them to stay with your business, right? Compared to, some consultant has basically outsourced my job to train people, right? Those are the sort of lessons you learn, using what I call UPS's practice of taking the time, really thinking through what the problem is, thinking through what the right solution is, right? Not just running to a solution because it's in the spotlight, oh, we're going to get rid of the current VR headsets and we're going to use the Vision Pro, right? No, from a business standpoint, that doesn't make sense, right? You have to be practical. Those are the things that, for any business that's getting into this, those are things that they're going to have to learn. You can't rely on a consultant to give you that.
I think that makes a fair amount of sense. I think where a lot of big agencies or even smaller niche agencies offer the most value from my perspective is just sheer like manpower and expertise. So once you have, and I've interviewed a fair amount of agencies on the podcast, and a lot of them say the same thing. They're like, we are masters of tools, but our clients need to define the actual problems and the values that we need to solve for. And then we can come in as masters of these tools and help them accomplish those programs within a timeline or add additional insights to those programs.
The consultancy provides, and it's where you're good, right? Because you're specialists. The consultants have experience using the tools. I am biased because I used to be one, right? The speed to complete the project, right? That's where I describe it as it's production versus a POC, right? Proof of concept is just a proof of concept, right? In a lot of organizations, they make the mistake to take that proof of concept and immediately slap it into production because it's successful. Like the formula is working, right? So don't change it, throw it into production, right? And then you have trainers saying, well, the curriculum's not right. You need to make these changes, right? And I think for a lot of consultants in the past, say in like 2018, 2019, right? That was a common thing that happened and sort of jaded enterprise towards the technology because, they relied too heavily on that specialty, right? And there's a lot of use cases that didn't go well or as expected. And, now it's a case where the industry sort of changed. So
yeah, now it's a matter of instead of trying to say VR is this shiny new tool that can solve any problem, it's like no, VR is really great for some things. Let's talk about those things first, figure out what they are, who's responsible for them, who can own them.
The term we use when we talk to business is, what's the pain point? What's the real business problem you're trying to solve, right? So case in point with the building walls, right? The real business problem was retention and instilling confidence to a new employee, right? We don't want people leaving because they had a bad supervisor that trained them, right? You want consistent, engaging, confident curriculum for what it was. When you say those words now, XR training is very good at that, right? And that's a case of just finding the right formula to start solving and creating the ROI for those problems, right? And that mindset is the right way to approach it. Instead of, hey, I have got this really cool gadget, I got to do something with it, right? When you're in that situation, you're going to have paperweights. Someone's going to say, oh, this is really cool for 4 hours. And then it's going to sit over on that corner of their desk. And then when the cardboard box come around to clean stuff off, all of a sudden, boop, it goes in. And then a year later, they're like, where'd that go? Oh, yeah, it didn't go well.
So I think there's it's so cool to see you're one of the few people that I know I keep emphasizing this, but you've experienced kind of both sides of the beginning of championing this technology and what that was like to start versus now you've been humming a little while, and I'm sure things are a little different now than they were a few years ago. And so I'm curious, like, how these business problems become apparent to you. Like when you're first championing it, I imagine there's a little bit more hunting around and trying to kind of start the conversation with people versus now you probably have a little more social proof, a little bit more examples of success where people might hear about it and come to you more. That's just an assumption. But I'm curious to get your take on when you were first championing versus now, how do you identify these pain points and kind of start the conversation with you business leaders?
The first thing I would say is usually the best business cases, the best use cases don't come from upper management. They come from boots on the ground. It's somebody in an environment and they're like, hey, why don't we have this? Right? That's typically how my best conversations happen. And usually the individuals contacting me from an organizational standpoint, they're going to be my future subject matter expert. Because what it is I'll do an internal talk. I do an internal presentation to the organization every month, and we'll focus on different business groups, because in each organizational business group I have practitioners that are learning the trade, right? And in doing that, we're also educating employees, right? So I'll be doing a presentation. 3 years ago, I remember there was this one lady. I was talking about intergrads hazard stuff, and after the presentation, she sends me an email. She says, "Why don't we have the same thing that package car has, but for feeders, for tractor trailers?" And I was like, "Well, that's a great question. Why don't we have that?" Right? And at the time, there was a brilliant VP. His name was Jamie. I basically was like, "Who's in charge of transportational training for a trailer?" Right? And I got this vice president's name. And one nice thing about UPS is senior manager generally is approachable, right? They like you to follow the chain of command, but upper management is approachable, right? So I sent him an email. I said, "Hey, would you guys be interested in this?" And he was like, I said, "Find something on my calendar the next day." I had a meeting with him, right? And then I mentioned this person. I said, she has an interesting question. Why don't we? And then the initial answer was, well, we do. You spend millions of dollars on these expensive tractor trailer simulators that will run at certain sites, right? Because that's traditionally how we've done it. Just like the Air Force does it. UPS does the same thing, but for vehicles. And I was like, okay, but that's a scaling problem, right? So now it's a scaling problem that I'm identifying. So we kind of just work through it, right? That's generally how these problems come about. It'll be just individuals that just are acute to a problem, and they're like, "Hey, could this technology solve the problem?" Right? And most of the time, it's a case of they'll come saying, "Oh, this will solve the problem," and I'll be like, "Okay, back up. What's the pain point?" Right? It goes back to what's the pain point here, right? And then the answer was, well, we actually instituted the technology in that space, not because there wasn't this solution already that solved it, but we were solving the scaling problem, which is enough drivers can't actually get time at a particular center to do the training, right? So with doing that, right, we designed a platform that was more scalable. It was a case of, the classroom in the box. You can mail it to a trainee and they can go through the process, right? We did something similar with, I was part of UPS Foundation, where the Jim Casey Foundation did road code for the Boys and Girls Club of America, right? And they faced that problem, because originally the Boys and Girl Club used to have these simulators going around for, driver safety or whatever, right? And they were like, but we can't get it to enough of our organizational clubs, right? What can we do, right? And that scaling problem came up again. So not only is it a case of boots on the ground, identify it, but also your similar business groups, they also start identifying it, right? And then now you're identifying a trend, right? And then as an architect, right, someone who's designing and maintaining these systems, you need to identify that, right? Because now you have a repeatable model or a repeatable solution that can have a good ROI.
So I like this idea that the source of the pain comes from the front lines. And then I think one of the issues that a lot of people on the front lines feel in these big enterprises is they don't know what they can get approval to do to solve a lot of those problems sometimes. And it's really a difficult conversation to have. I don't think everyone feels very comfortable trying to push innovation within a big company. And that's okay, right? Like not everyone needs to be an entrepreneur. Like a lot of people are out here just trying to do their work and do their day-to-day jobs.
Well,
And that's great.
Considering the current economic situation, right? I think even in my own organization, right, there's sort of a pullback because, people, in economic times like now, people worry, people don't want to lose their job because, they try to be helpful. They try to be innovative, right? Good management, should, expect that and respond to that, right? And not make it a negative experience. But, there are organizations that are like that. So, and then I would say that's more about that organization and less about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I was going to say one thing I liked about your anecdote of that example of the tractors is I think that your team collecting that feedback helps give a bridge where you're able to then approach senior leadership with some like logic behind it, right? Because you have more experience with the solution that might help. So you're able to qualify that solution a little bit more so that when it gets translated to leadership, it's communicated in a way where maybe that frontline employee just didn't know how to communicate it in that way. They weren't sure how to
Yes.
properly qualify it, right? Like you
Yeah,
mentioned,
that's the term we use called domain owner, right? So
Mhm.
inside of UPS, I am the head of immersive technology, right? So I'm the domain owner of this type of technology, right? And it's more because I'm passionate about it, right? I am willing to go to the mats for Susan, who's a feeder driver, at a particular location. Um, that might be a more unique or sort of new way to look at it. A fellow friend of mine, he now works for Axion. The term he used for someone who's a domain owner is very passionate about it in a big organization is a cheat code, right? He's like, Mark, you're the cheat code for UPS because you get it, you understand the technology, but you need someone in your business to also be able to communicate that and the benefits of that to senior management, right? And do it in a way where it's constructive. It's not sort of overly salesy, and it's not muted, if you know what I mean. So,
Totally. Well,
yeah.
this brings up a question because last time we talked, you shared a little bit around the subject matter experts that you're building within the company, and you've created almost this network of champions for this type of technology within their own respected areas. But something I thought was really interesting is this wasn't like a ragtag team of four innovators that are just the innovation hub, right? Like these were actual people working in different business units that experience those problems, that actually work on where those solutions will offer value. And so I was curious how you manage that type of network like that. How do you identify who's going to be a good subject matter expert, get them on board, and kind of maintain that program?
Well, I mean, we call it it's sort of our federated trainer or subject matter expert program. It's a sort of UPS IT university sort of curriculum path that we created because one person can't scale it. Um, Generally, the people that send me the emails and say, why can't or why aren't we, right? In my opinion, they're always the best people. One, because I call it's the idea or thought grenade. The thought grenade has gone off. They had the thought themselves, right? I didn't have to sit there doing a XR Bible preaching presentation, right? They themselves applied it and identified it, right? That's a huge step for anyone. Um, and then typically that would be sort of my primary recruitment method is actually having management be open and say, hey, you want to talk about VR, go talk to Mark Gröb, right? And then Mark Gröb, gets an email and I go, oh, cool. This is a great idea. Let's have a chat. And I'll have virtually a virtual coffee chat with them, right? That would be subject number one, right? Subject number two would actually be the group as a whole. They identify there's a need for that type of individual. I call it sort of an entrepreneur for a particular business silo,
I
right?
just heard
Around,
that word for the first
you know,
time, and I love that
interactivity,
word.
entrepreneur. Entrepreneur is an old word. It's like when I was going to college for my undergrad, that was a word that they used for entrepreneurs that were inside of large organizations. Um, but that would be the second type of person, right? It's someone where they are generally innovative. They may already have the skill set. Typically, what I would describe as at UPS is we have students that come in with UX degrees or game development degrees, and they're like, oh, yeah, I got a .NET developer job at UPS building mobile apps for logistics, right? And then management will be like, hey, maybe there's an opportunity for some sort of digital twin solution here, right? And this person has this sort of background, right? And then the ideal situation there is explaining to them how that skill set transitions to this median of immersive tech, right? And a lot of them, it's a no-brainer. They're just like, wow, this is a no-brainer, right? And in those second cases, if I've had situations where someone's come to me and they're like, hey, UPS should do this. And I'll be like, oh, wait a second. They'll be in my lab or whatever. Oh, wait a second. And I'll walk over to a drawer, pull out a device that would do what they want to do. And I'm like, oh, this you mean, and they're like, what? You already did it? And I was like, yes, it was a POC 2 years ago, right? When I look to them is, okay, help me think this through better, right? Because we gave it a shot. For whatever reason, it didn't pick up, right? You're passionate about this because you're coming to me saying, why aren't we doing it, right? I'll hand it back to them and say, give me a new argument for management, right? And I have numerous cases where I've had someone come back, give me the new argument, and we've proceeded further with the project, or it's become production afterwards, right? So, because some of this technology, right, it needs time. It can't just, innovation is a challenge because sometimes you're doing things that are ahead of its time, or not all the parts needed are ready yet, right? So yeah,
I think there's a lot of truth in that. A lot of things that we tried, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, just weren't ready. And I think there's also some things that we come up with that we think are going to be groundbreaking, and then a month later we're like, maybe we didn't need that
they're
anymore.
not the killer app.
Is there an example of that in the last, 10, 15 years, of something you really thought was going to be a killer app and then it kind of was disappointing or didn't end up being that for you?
Work related, we did a provisional patent on augmented last mile. So the idea of, I would look at a package and then it would show me exactly where you want it delivered at your house, right? The ideal example would actually be like an apartment complex or a condo complex, right? Where you can't just deliver something to the drop area or the mailbox area of the apartment, right? You have to actually deliver it to at the door, right? Because it's a COD or who knows, right? I really thought AR glasses, it was a no-brainer, makes perfect sense, right? But once we had a solution, we took it out to the field, it just wasn't ready yet. GPS wasn't accurate enough, or what the certified address location based on long lat was not actually accurate, right? Or typically it deals with, the y-axis, right? Altitude. Physics is an imperfect science in a way, right? Because the device, based on air pressure and everything else, will say you're at the right altitude, right? And the reality is you're one floor down or one floor up. That was tech to me that I thought was a great type of use case for a company like UPS, right? But when we started trialing it in the real environment, there were still cases where the technology wasn't accurate enough or wasn't seamless enough to meet that, right? And you're like, bummer, that would be one case. Funny story, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I did a startup, 360-degree operating system, right? Ran on Mac OS and Windows NT, right? Now, the Vision OS, right? Sometimes innovation's too early, right? I call it bleeding tech, right? And it's just part of the game of innovation when we start looking at tools and what we want to build. So
Totally.
And for XR, it's been a constant hype cycle, right? We kind of do things, virtual desktops are coming back around. We had Envelope, we had virtual desktop, and a whole bunch of other products when they first came back in 2014, 2015, right? Now we see Immersed, we see Arthur, we see other products that are now coming in, right? Is it the time for those types of technologies? Who knows? We'll see.
Yeah, it's always tricky. I think one of the hardest things, maybe less from inside of a buying company like a UPS or some sort of brand, more so for the vendors that support the ecosystem. I think the focus is one of the biggest struggles for most of the vendors in the space. Everyone wants to do all the exciting things, but most of these companies are young startups or mid-sized companies. They're not massive enterprises that are supporting the ecosystem for the most part, right? Like obviously the gaming engines and the hardware are exceptions to that. But I think a lot of folks spread themselves really, really thin, trying to be everything for everybody instead of focusing on like their one core little area that they can master and really take a shot at. One other thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is this idea of VR headsets in a physical office. Because right now we're like well past the post COVID step, right? Like it's almost nauseating to see COVID in a slide deck anymore. On that first slide of COVID changed the world, here we are, right? Like we've all heard it so many times. And now we're in this new place where remote work is here to stay for some people, and return to office is a big thing that companies are preaching. And now we're stuck with this weird hybrid thing that nobody asked for and nobody wanted. And so I was thinking to myself, like, I have some people I want to collaborate with in VR that don't have headsets. I have more than one headset. Maybe if I bring a headset over, we could both jump in VR together. And I was like, but then do I need to be in VR with them because we're both in the same room? Like, do I actually care about that anymore? And at first I was thinking, to catch up personally, no, I want to see your face. Like, I want to like look at you in the eye. If we're doing independent work, we can do that on our laptops from different parts of the room and just kind of chit chat in between. Sure. But I started thinking, there are use cases where in an office space, we go into a conference room or separate from our typical day-to-day, and we've got like a whiteboard or a TV screen or like a couple things, but we're really limited by the physics of the sticky note or the size of the whiteboard or the pens that we have access to, the size of the room, whatever. And I started thinking, I actually could see a use case for us both wearing a VR headset in a physical location at the same time and being able to still benefit from this medium. And so I was curious to get your thoughts on that. It sounds like you have one kind of more extreme example where you've got physical cars and like there's a mixed reality component. But do you think there is a use case to bring virtual reality or mixed reality headsets into the actual office space when
Sure.
returning back to office?
We are currently, I'd say, on the training side, right? We saw a lot of benefit with we are doing hazmat responder training, right? So in an environment like that, having the headsets and the people in the same room actually was a lot of benefit. The instructor could see what the person's doing, but we could also sort of holographically simulate things that you normally wouldn't want to have happen in the office, right? So there's that aspect, right? But then there's also the sales aspect, right? The devices have a unique ability that sometimes we call them superpowers, right? So things like, if you look at the old ad agency, right? Ad agencies used to have war rooms, right? So they take over a conference room for a campaign, right? That's one space where there's a lot of value to that, right? Specifically, if you have a global team, right? You have a case where, yeah, you do have the need to, you and myself being in the same conference room, be able to look at and kind of review, annotate in a virtual reality, right? A particular campaign piece, fair enough, right? We can redo a product virtually before ever, dictating material to it, right? We're able to see, something very small, so molecular, right? We can, in real time, look at things, right? You could say there's a power in sort of being able to pull yourself out of the real into the virtual because you can sort of get a different perspective on the problem, right? Those are the scenarios where we're starting to see the value to that aspect, right? So, okay, yeah, maybe we'll have XR lounges for salespeople where salespeople can go in and run, virtual sales trainings or, product demonstrations, in a conference room, right? Or at the same time they're doing that, right, get support or supervision from another global team outside this region, right, in real time, right? The age-old story, cost savings just with traveling, right? I don't know about you, but in the US, it's a nightmare just going from, New York to Las Vegas, right? The cost is there, right? The flight alone pays for a VR headset. So it's all those sort of things, those economic, business variables, problems that, feed into it. And it's identifying what the technology is good at. So, there's value in the workplace even if it's face to face, because it's the ability to sort of remotely share and work through something, right? Some sort of experience together, right? That's something the technology does very well. The flip side to that is, right, in enterprise, the dark horse to that is security, right? Business wants to make sure technology is private. And that's one area I see right now in XR that's still a challenge, because XR devices and technology is not up to the standard of, say, mobile enterprise, right? And my hopes is in the coming years, we're going to see more improvement with that.
Yeah, and I know we've only got a couple of minutes left here, but maybe we could just double click on security real quick, like the 1 to 2 minute version. What are some of the, like, if you had a hit list of problems with security in VR that you think could use the
Well, I
most
mean, the
solving?
big elephant in the room, obviously, is, right. Majority of the devices in the market's owned by a social network, right? So in enterprise, a lot of enterprises block that social network, right? So in that alone, it sort of makes it very challenging for practitioners in enterprise to utilize the technology, right? Um, there's the aspects of, just from a cultural standpoint, I talked about, people perceive certain devices as just VR consoles, right? Where you look at Oculus, Meta, it started in gaming and maintains dominance in gaming, right? You look at Vive, it sort of always was, in my mind, an enterprise product, right? It's a dumb device when it was tethered, and now when it's all in one, right? It's highly manageable. It is something that follows sort of the key principles that we look at when we look at security and privacy inside of enterprise, right? But both these technologies still utilize gaming frameworks to create the functionality of, say, multi-user, right? Well, corporate policy or firewall may block the ports one way or the other, right, to utilize that technology, right? And unlike a Facebook or a metaverse, public metaverse, in enterprise, your company, your business is paying for every byte you're using, right? So there's that running cost, right? Where someone like Mark Zuckerberg, he doesn't have to incur the cost, because you, as a consumer, you're using your own personal Wi-Fi, right? Internet, whatever, right? First, in an enterprise environment, right? Those are all added costs to your ROI model. Hopefully that makes sense.
Definitely. No, I think
To
that's
me, those are sort of the two big ones, right? Is you have to deal with that. And those are things where, you know, um, when I started at UPS, just the culture, the idea of, no, we don't use games for training. We don't gamify training, right? That's where very quickly you learn to say, these are experiences, these are simulations, these are not games, these are simulations, right? They are interactive like a game, but their measurement and reason and goals are different, right? Those are kind of the chief big three when I look at XR and enterprise. Those are the big challenges that, consultants and everyone else are trying to figure out, and as a member at UPS, right? We're always looking at those things.
yeah, Mark. I could ask you probably 100 more questions and spend 10 hours talking to you about this stuff.
I'm always happy to come back. I really
Yeah,
appreciate, Rick taking the time, kind of hanging out. It's always fun to
it's
talk shop.
so much fun and just so much insight. Like one of the reasons I even started the show is I think there's a lot to be said about the underlying technology and the creative, but when it comes to the business management of how you buy, how you sell, how you market, how you talk about this technology for the enterprise, that's still lacking. And there's still a lot of training and education around that needs to happen. And, you're top tier in that area. So appreciate you taking the time. Before we hop
Pleasure.
off, anything you want to share as far as stuff you're working on, where people can follow or find you, or anything along those lines?
I mean, I don't want to say I'm a content creator. I'm just a guy that, is going down the adventurous road of XR. My thing would just be, if anyone has any questions or, wants to reach out like you have, I mean, I'm available. One way the community is going to expand and succeed in enterprise is us working together. So, UPS wants to see that succeed, and, we're here for it.
Collaboration's at the core. I love it. Well, thanks so much again, and that's the pod.